Hello, friends. Today's psalm of the day is Psalm 78. And Psalm 78 is kind of a long one, but it's got a lot for us. So we're going to take a look at it today and see how we can learn and grow from what this psalm, written, 4,000 or so years ago, has to say. So here's what we know Psalm 78 is written by somebody named Asaph. And Asaph is a poet and a songwriter who lived and served during the reigns of David and Solomon. So he's contemporaries with David, which is important to remember as you're seeing his references to David and his references to events prior to David. And really, what happens in this psalm is Asaph is encouraging us to talk about what God has done for us and to see the results of obedience or disobedience in light of what God has done for us. So we start in verses 2 through 4. And Asaph says, I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things, things from of old, things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. So he's setting this up. We're going to talk about what God has done for our people. And our people, from Asaph's perspective, is Israel. So he's going to talk about Genesis, way back with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and all the things, and Moses and all the things that have been done for God's people throughout the generations. So he does that, and he goes on and on and on about what happened and how really those people were rebellious despite everything that he did for them. In verse 32 and 33, he says, in spite of all this, in spite of all God's goodness, they kept on sinning. In spite of his wonders, they did not believe. So he ended their days in futility and their years in terror. Now, did not believe was something that jumped out to me, because that isn't to say that those people didn't believe that God created the earth and didn't believe there was a God. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying that they didn't believe that God was who he says he was, who he said he was. Because if they believed that God was their protector and their provider and sovereign over all the universe, they wouldn't have rebelled against him. They would have trusted his word. They would have done what he said. When he said to go into the promised land to Moses and the people, they would have done it. They wouldn't have been afraid and felt like God wasn't going to protect them. Because in those moments of being afraid and doubting what God had said to them, they weren't believing in God. And the same applies to us. Believing in God doesn't mean just ascribing to a set of facts. It means putting all our eggs in the basket of this truth to show that we truly believe and trust in the verity of what we've been told. So that's what the accusation is of the Israelites, and the result of that accusation, he ended their days in futility. They didn't get all the things that were promised to them. Those promises are still going to come true, but they didn't yet. Then verse 38, yet he was merciful. He forgave their iniquities and did not destroy them. Time after time he restrained his anger and did not stir up his full wrath. One of the big blessings of going through this chapter by chapter is dispelling the legend that the God of the Old Testament was cruel. He was not. He was more patient than I could ever be, and he gave them time after time to obey what he had told them, and he blessed them in the midst of their disobedience. And that's what this is talking about. So he was merciful. He didn't just destroy them as they had earned, but they still forgot. That's what it goes on to say. It talks about how they still forgot what God had done to get them out of Egypt. He had taken them to Egypt to support them during this famine, and then brought them out once they had been able to multiply within Egypt. He brought out millions of them, provided for them in the desert, clearly miraculously, and they still didn't trust in him. What did they do? Verse 56. But they put God to the test and rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep his statutes. So ultimately, they continued to ignore him. They continued to not believe in him, because believing means being obedient when you believe that he is God. And then finally, verse 65. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, as a warrior wakes from the stupor of wine. And it talks about how now, as Asaph and David and Solomon exist in Israel, kind of at its early pinnacle during the reign of David. Certainly going to get better later on, but thus far, this was a high point in Hebrew history. Um, at this point, God has woken up again and has provided for his people and given them victory over their enemies, and done a lot of it through David, through the ministry of David. Verse 72, and David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands he led them. So all of this history isn't just to say, hey, don't forget, appreciate what your forefathers did for you. It's not that at all. It's saying, look at what happens over and over again in history. God provides so amazingly, and the people turn away. And what happens when they turn away for long enough? God withdraws that provision, and the people suffer. And what's the message from Asaph and David and Solomon? Listen, be obedient, follow what he says, believe, because all of those things are included in true belief. And that's the message to us. The message is, remember what God has done. Remember how he's always been faithful. Remember how relatively little is asked of us in light of everything he's done completely undeservedly for us. And be obedient. Not because God's this taskmaster who wants to see how much he can get us to do, but because he lays out this path of obedience. And if we follow it, life's going to be better. He designed us, and he's telling us how he wants us to operate. So we should operate that way. And if we do, we're going to be fulfilled. We're going to be successful in the ways that God has designed for us to be successful. And we're going to bring him glory in our life. Now, this is a theme that we see throughout Scripture. We see this retelling of what's happened in days past. You see it, when he talks to Jacob, and he says, I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac. He reminds him of the promises that have been made in the past. Then he talks to Moses and reminds him of the promises that have been made. Now he's talking to David and Asaph and reminding them. And even in Acts chapter 7, we see Stephen in the speech that ends up getting him killed, getting him murdered, reminding all the Israelites of what has happened in years past and how they've rebelled. It isn't to beat them over the head with their mistakes, but to show them the value of obedience and the amount of things and the amount of blessings and the amount of grace and mercy that God has provided, despite the fact that we don't deserve any of it. So think about all that. Think about what God has given you in your specific life, but larger in the life of the church, and what promises he's told you about in Scripture, and how you can have faith in those promises and truly believe in him. And that true belief will lead to obedience, joy, and fellowship with God. So that's Psalm 78. I hope this is useful to you, and I pray you have a great day. God bless.